Ilya Strebulaev, welcome to Book Sell Radio.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh my gosh, it's my pleasure. It's not every day I get to talk to one of the world's leading experts on VC and private equity, and you've just written this new book, The Venture Mindset. So I want to dig in. What prompted you to write the book to start with?
Yeah, that is a great question. I've been teaching at Stanford Graduate School of Business for 20 years. And what prompted me initially to turn to venture capital is that I'm a professor of finance. I've been teaching finance to my MBA students. And then many of them became either founders of venture-backed companies or they became venture capitalists. And what I realized is that very often they make decisions very differently from how we teach them in our finance classes. So I got very intrigued by that. And amazingly enough, at the time, there was nobody at Stanford who was doing research on venture capital for a good reason, because it was very difficult to get data and it was very difficult to understand how VCs make decisions. And by the way, it was considered to be a very small niche industry. And then I very quickly realized that first, venture capitalists make decisions very differently because they're facing very different environment. I would say very hostile environment of very high uncertainty.
Interesting.
Second,
okay, so you identified that you were teaching them to do one thing, but they were doing something else. And
that's right.
I'd be curious to know what the delta was between the two. What were they doing and what were you teaching them?
Well, what I was teaching them is what I think finance will tell you, how to make decisions in, let's say, if you are the chief finance officer of a large company.
DCF cash flow,
for example,
yeah.
DCF cash flows, NPVs, and so on. And then, as venture capitalists, as my subsequent research found out, less than 10% of VCs ever use DCF or NPV analysis. And there's a good reason for that. And that's what I've discovered. And that's why I wrote the book. And the book is effectively about the principles of how venture capitalists make decisions. But the real reason why I wrote the book is slightly different, which is what I realized after spending years and years of studying venture capital, is that most of us, most decision makers in organizations far away from Silicon Valley, far away from venture capital, can benefit from those specific tricks that smart VCs use when they make decisions.
Okay, you whetted my appetite there. I'm now really intrigued by the tricks. Because our audience, I think for a lot of them, they've chosen not to pursue venture capital, either because their business model doesn't lend itself to that, or they haven't been able to attract it, whatever the reasons. But I'd be curious to know some of the tricks that VCs use to make decisions. What did you find in your research?
Well, there are many, many tricks, okay? And so the book is organized as 9 principles of the venture mindset, where behind each principle that I found in my research, there are a lot of practical implementations. So let me give you a couple of examples, okay?
Be great.
So one example is the principle that I call get outside the 4 walls. What do I mean by that? Let me start with my research. I studied venture capitalists and I compared them with the corporate innovators, those in large companies who are in charge of innovation. And I compared their networks, with whom they talk. What I found out is that venture capitalists have much wider networks, but also they're much more diversified, which means that the network comes from different industries, different age, different background, different education, different geography. While corporate innovators, those who are in charge of new things, their networks are very undiversified, maybe within the same firm, or maybe all those people with whom they went to college. The reason venture capitalists do this is because they don't really know where the next idea is going to come from. And that is why they cast their networks wide. So they're trying to enrich their network. And this is how I think people in all other organizations should nowadays approach their networks. In fact, I'm doing a lot of strategic offsites at large companies, And very often what people do after this strategic offsite, or maybe even during it, they will go on their LinkedIn profile and start crawling and start seeing actually with whom they are connected. But this is not constrained to large organizations. So if you are a business owner, okay, of a, let's say, medium-sized company, ask yourself, what is your network? And whether your network, your current network, allows you to achieve your long-term goals. And most of the time, when in research we've done this, we looked at the networks of people. We found out the answer is no. These networks are too small, not meaningful, and undiversified.
Interesting. I'm guilty of this myself because I often find myself myopically kind of focusing on my business and not thinking laterally enough, not taking those coffee meetings which are proposed from time to time. And I probably fall into the same trap you're referring to. So one of the 9 tricks or the 9 kind of sections of the book, get outside the 4 walls. Would you share another one of the kind of ways that the kind of venture mindset's different?
Sure. So another principle is say no 100 times. And let me start with something that I think is really useful to our listeners today. Whenever I teach venture capital, or whenever I lead strategic offsites, I always play with my students, my participants, what I call a piggy bank game. You know piggy banks?
Sure.
Okay. Have you hold one? Okay. Mm-hmm. So imagine a classroom of, let's say, 60 people. Okay. All of them are executives and companies or owners of businesses. In fact, recently I had one with YPO participants.
Sure.
And I bring a piggy bank of decent size. And this piggy bank is absolutely filled to the neck with pennies. It's very heavy. I actually will approach you and will give it for you to hold. You say, wow, it's very heavy. And then we'll play a game. First, everybody will have to guesstimate how much money is in the piggy bank. Is it $5? Is it $50? Is it $1,000? Again, it's full only of 1 cent coins. And then we'll play the piggy bank auction game. What is the piggy bank auction game? Well, you're going to bid, and you're going to bid for how much you would like to buy the piggy bank from me. Now, not the piggy bank itself, but the money inside. For example, let's say you bid $10, and the piggy bank contains $20 in pennies. And you win, which means that everybody else bid less than you. Okay? Then you give me $10 and I give you $20. So your net win is $10. Now, if you bid $30 and the piggy bank contains $20, you're going to lose $10. Does it make sense?
100%.
So I'm playing this game and I'm going to reveal a secret, 2 secrets. One secret is I played this game more than 1,000 times. And I'm yet to lose. Every single time I win between $5 and I think my max is $2,000.
Okay.
Which means that somebody seriously bid, okay, more than $2,000 for the amount of money in the piggy bank. Okay. Now I have many piggy banks, so I'm going to reveal the amount of money in one, which I will never use. Okay. Again, which is $11.87. So I never lose. Okay. Why I never lose and why every single listener, okay, has really to think through this, maybe even to listen to this game description again, okay? I never win. I never lose, okay, I never lose, is because the winner wins only and only because the winner bids more than anybody else. So there are 60 smart participants. The one who wins is the one who overbid the other 59. And they're all trying to estimate the same value. Okay? And once you win, And this has a special name. It's called the winner's curse. The winner's curse, because the winner here is cursed. Why it is really important? So, do you know that research shows that about 90% of all M&As, mergers and acquisitions, is a losing proposition for the acquirer?
I did not know.
And
that.
the explanation is the piggy bank game. So if you would like to buy any asset, if you would like to buy any business, okay, then you have to think very, very carefully through this. Because maybe you're going to buy this and you will bid more than anybody else, including the owner of the business, because you overestimated the amount of pennies in the piggy bank, so to say. Like the guy who paid $2,000, okay, for one of my piggy banks. The venture capitalists know this because they see it all the time. In Silicon Valley, we call FOMO, F-O-M-O, fear of missing out. So that VCs are prepared to overpay because they feel that maybe they're going to be behind if there's a new trend emerging. Smart VCs, though, avoid FOMO. And I think that is what we all can learn from venture capitalists. So, how do VCs avoid FOMO? First, as I mentioned, say no 100 times. What my research discovered is that for each deal that VCs make, they typically pass on, reject more than 100 opportunities. More important, what I found out is that they use a very different decision-making process at the top of their deal funnel, and that's what I call a fast lane, and at the bottom, slow lane. At the top of the funnel, their goal is to go quickly from 100 to 10 opportunities. And here is the trick. And the trick is they're asking a very different question. They're asking the question, why should I not proceed even thinking about investing in this opportunity? And this adding not is really critical, John. So this is what's it's really important to understand. So if I ask a question, should I invest in this or should I not invest in this? The answer is going to be completely different. In fact, the way our brain is wired to make decisions is going to be completely different. So had my participants in all those piggy bank exercises started by asking, why should I not bid at all? Likely, they would have come up with a very different decision. In fact, I know that they would, because we've done research on this. Okay, so once people asking these questions, they use the red flags to identify that maybe that is a bad investment opportunity. And that is what the smartest venture capitalists that follow the venture mindset do. Okay. Now, in writing the book, The Venture Mindset, we did my co-author and I did a lot of fun stuff. And one fun stuff is we watched hundreds of hours of Shark Tank. Have you ever watched Shark Tank?
Sure. Yeah.
Episode, but maybe not hundreds of hours. Okay.
No.
By the way, in Canada, it's called Dragon's Den. So we watched that as well. Now, why? One important reason we did is because we wanted to identify how sharks or dragons react to those fast lane questions. And here's what we found out, is that sharks, whenever they approach a startup, a proposition from a business owner, from a founder, from the executive team, they're trying to identify a red flag. And if the answer fails the red flag, and you can see it from the facial expressions that we studied, they lose interest. They just completely check out. They just don't ask any more questions. Just think about this. I think that one of the mistakes, and I've been working a lot with large companies and the business units in large companies, one mistake they do is that they do not use the red flag approach too frequently. So they really ignore the piggy bank conclusion. they go and start doing due diligence right away, which is the slow lane. Okay. So my suggestion to your listeners is, first, re-listen this piggy bank and try to think about this. Okay, that's actually a very deep game. Second is use the red flag, fast lane approach. Whenever in hiring, in any investment decisions, in deciding to open a new shop, new product, new business line, new location, start by asking, why should I not do it? And only if you cannot find a red flag, then proceed.
One of the things that I was really keen to learn more about from you is the difference between venture capital and private equity, because I know at Stanford you teach both disciplines, and I think from time to time those two things get conflated or confused in the mind of our listeners. And so, can you describe what the difference between venture capital and private equity is?
Sure, John. It's a great question. And I do teach two classes, one on venture capital and another one on private equity. And both are very popular, but different types of students take those two classes. So here's the best and easiest way to differentiate between venture capital and traditional private equity, which is known as buyouts. Okay? In venture capital, people with a venture mindset follow the following principle: home runs matter, strikeouts don't. What this really means? This means that if we look at the data, and by the way, we have the data at Stanford Venture Capital Initiative on most venture-backed companies that ever raise money in this country. So if you look at the data, you find out that out of 20 typical early stage venture deals, 15 or more fail. So investors lose money. And then 2 or 3 will return you maybe $2 or $3 per dollar invested, which isn't bad. That is until you realize that, gosh, it will not cover all your losses. And then statistically, 1 out of 20 deals will be a home run. And home run is you will get $100 or more per each dollar invested. And I'm sure all of your listeners would love to get $100 per dollar. The trick with home runs is that in the venture business, if you do want to have home runs, you need to embrace strikeouts. So without failures, without a very high failure rate, you will not get home runs. And the entire decision-making process of the venture capitalists, especially those in the early stage, are all about increasing the odds of a home run. And if by doing so, they also increase their failure rate or their loss ratio, that's okay. In the private equity mindset, on the other hand, in the traditional buyout space, you cannot afford too many strikeouts, because even your best home runs will not likely generate 100x. So in your best possible world, maybe you'll get $10 or $15 per dollar investment, but more likely you'll get 5 or 6. So as a result of this, the categories such as the loss ratio start mattering again. By the way, it doesn't mean that smart private equity investors don't use the venture mindset. There are a lot of principles of the venture mindset, such as the piggy bank, that in fact is universally applicable. But this home run matter strikeout don't principle, I think, is specific to the venture capitalists, but also specific to a high degree of uncertainty. So if in your business, you're facing a lot of uncertainty, or in your business you can experiment sometimes, then home runs principle does work. But if it's a very stable environment, then you don't need home runs, because you also cannot afford to do a lot of strikeouts. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think our audience, our listeners, are getting bombarded today with solicitations from private equity groups because their, investment hurdles are lower. They're not looking to have the home run, but they're looking for, over a period of time, a single or a double, to use the baseball analogy or to extend the baseball analogy. I'd be curious, this is my own personal fascination falling into play here, but what do you find to be the difference between people who choose your private equity class versus those who opt for your venture capital class? Like psychographically, how are they different?
Of course. But before that, John, one piece of advice for your audience that is being contacted by the private equity guys. And that is a piece of advice from the venture mindset, in fact, is that, many of my students become founders of venture-backed companies. And they raise a lot of money. In fact, startups raise money all the time. And what is the best piece of advice one can give? The best piece of advice is try to get more than one offer from investors, or try to get an offer from more than one investor, really. What I often observe is that too many founders, but also too many traditional businesses, when they would like to sell themselves, they start negotiating, maybe because of serendipitous meeting, maybe because of random luck or introductions, etc., to one specific investor. But what you really would like to generate, you would like to be me, Professor Ilya, with a piggy bank in your hand. You would like to ensure that there is a competition for you. And then your valuation is going to be much higher. So if you're thinking about if you're being bombarded by these private equity investors and you would like to start negotiating with them, then try to make sure that you contact a lot of other investors at the same time. Okay?
Sage wisdom for sure.
Going back to your question about students, of course they're different. So my venture capital class is mostly for students who would like to become founders of venture-backed companies. And indeed, I had more than 600 of them who came through my class and became founders. And many of them became the CEOs of venture-backed companies, and there are more than 20 of them became founders of unicorns, very highly valuable venture-backed companies. And some of them then become venture capitalists as well, venture capital investors that follow those venture-minded principles, such as home runs matter, strikeout not. The private equity class is mostly attended by those who would like to go into traditional buyouts. So those who, in fact, will be likely contacting your audience, John, with the suggestions to sell their businesses. By the way, it's not necessarily traditional buyouts. More recently, what is very popular, and a lot of this coming from Stanford, and a lot of this done by my students, are called search funds. And the search fund, effectively, is a private equity fund where a founder, a manager, is looking for just one company to buy and operate. And I think search funds is a very interesting proposition for many owners of medium-sized businesses if they would like to sell their business to somebody who is going to take over and not just flip it in a couple of years, but operate for many, many years.
I'd encourage our listeners to check out, we did an interview with a guy named Steve Davidikos who talks a lot about the search fund world and has sort of did a whole episode on that. And I think that's a very interesting exit potential for a lot of our listeners for sure. To go back to the difference in audience, what else can you tell me about the people in the classroom? Like psychographically, can you describe the difference between a VC, not just what they want to go do after school, but psychographically, maybe their backgrounds, their aspirations, like how are they different between two classes?
I think the difference is that as a founder of a startup, John, you are taking a lot of risks. You might fail. And so you really either have to be risk loving or you really have to be passionate about an idea so that you cannot do anything but think about how you're going to execute or implement this idea. And so I'm very lucky because I have a lot of students And I describe some of these deeply passionate examples in the book as well, that are so concentrated on the idea, they just cannot think of doing anything else. Let me give you an example. So a couple of years ago, I had a student. His name is René Cassie. He's originally from Canada. He was a surgeon in Canada and then came to Stanford and became my MBA student, business school student. And he became really passionate about building a healthcare platform that helped patients with rare diseases. You know, there are thousands of rare diseases, and it's very difficult for patients to get treatments. And he was so passionate about this, he could not think about anything else. And he convinced a lot of people to, in fact, drop school or to quit very highly paid jobs, to join him in building this startup. He didn't have the money, he didn't have the product, he had only this idea, passion, and they built an amazing product. And I'm very lucky to have been an advisor to this startup. But I have a lot of students like this that are taking this venture capital class. When we think about the private equity students, that they are more thinking about finance implications of their decisions. So many of them will go to and become investors in private equity firms. So they will be doing a lot of due diligence on companies. They will try to search companies that they would like to recommend the investment committees to acquire. So therefore, they're in fact using a lot of venture-minded principles as well. For example, how to go outside the four walls. So very often in this business, you have to find companies that are ready to be sold before anybody else does it. So that's why your audience is being bombarded by a lot of people, because these investors trying to find a next company to buy before anybody else discovers the same company.
So the venture capitalist, and now we're using broad generalizations here, and I assume that there's obviously outliers, but in your experience, the people who take your venture capital class are much more comfortable with risk. They tend to think probably fairly broadly, somewhat more creative. I'm assuming that the folks who take the private equity class are more financially conservative, more financially minded, maybe think more laterally in the way they approach a business problem. Would that be a fair characterization if we were to generalize?
It's really interesting, John. Everybody asks me this question. Most people think about venture capitalists as risk-loving creatures who love uncertainty. The reality is actually somewhat opposite. Venture capitalists are those who are trying to reduce uncertainty. In fact, I call them, it's very counterintuitive, I know, I call them risk reduction engineers. And here's why. It is true they invest in startups, early stage startups that are very uncertain. But these startups are going to be uncertain on many dimensions: the quality of the founding team, the size of the market, the business model, the unit economics, how to go to market, the product quality, etc., etc., etc. And so venture capitalists have to decide which risks they are prepared to take and which risks they are not prepared to take. And as a result of that, they really have to say, well, we are going to concentrate only on, for example, the market size. We are willing to take a bet on the market size, whether the market is going to be huge or the market is going to be small. But we're unprepared to take any other risks. So therefore, they in fact will spend a lot on due diligence on everything else. By the way, do you know that my research shows that venture capitalists on average spend almost 120 hours of due diligence on every single startup they end up investing in. So they're trying to reduce those risks as much as possible.
Interesting. So, I mean, I guess from my perspective, doesn't a private equity company also try to reduce risk? Like the partner in a private equity firm, aren't they also doing 120 hours of due diligence before they invest in a company?
They might even do more than 120 hours. But the difference here is that they have a lot of information at their fingertips.
Mm.
If you would like to buy a mature companies with a lot of cash flows and DCF projections and so on, you get access to the data room. You get access to contracts. You get access to accounting stuff. And you can spend months and days, weeks, or months trying to analyze this. Very often, venture capital, especially in early stage, actually there is not much financial information. There is no cash flow projections because there are no cash flows.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there's no revenues, and yet still you do a lot of analysis, just different type of analysis. Most likely, it's going to be qualitative analysis. So yes, it's trying to reduce risks. Every single type of analysis is in a way trying to reduce risks. But I think that traditional buyouts, they are reducing risk by performing a sophisticated technical financial due diligence on top of everything else, like legal due diligence, for example, accounting due diligence, etc. While venture capitalists are performing a lot of stuff that is very difficult to perform otherwise. And I think if your audience would like to perform something that is outside the normal, let's put it this way, standard financial due diligence, I think we can learn a lot from the venture capitalists.
Yeah, for sure. It's to be honest, it's a mindset that I don't understand. Like my perception from the outside, I don't really know anything about venture capital beyond superficial sort of stereotypes. My stereotype is a gambler, really, is what I see when I look at a venture capitalist. Someone, I again, to go back to the baseball analogy, I know we talked about that before, but there's the power hitter that goes to the plate and they strike out more than everybody else. And they're kind of selfish. And I think of them as that way, right? Like they're just swinging for the fences. And sure, every once in a while they connect and it's spectacular. Everybody gets up on their feet and claps for the power hitter. But for me, the more nuanced, the more subtle, the more professional, the more interesting is the private equity person, because to me, that's the person that's approaching it less as a gambler and more as a strategist. And again, everything we've talked about so far, I get that the fact that the venture capitalist is trying to de-risk and they're looking at macroeconomics and they're looking at the founders, but it seems like they still have this sort of reputation of, just throwing a bunch of bets down because one out of every, 20 is going to hit. And as long as I bet on 20, one's going to be. How have I got it wrong? Because I think that's, for a lot of my listeners, that's what they're saying. They're going, Ilya, I don't get it. I get the private equity guys all day long. I understand their business model. VCs just sound like swashbuckling, risk takers. Where am I getting it wrong?
Well, I know it is a stereotype, and like most stereotypes, they're not exactly correct. In fact, in this case, this stereotype is not correct. Now, I'm not saying that venture capitalists are more or less interesting than private equity guys. Okay, it's not about being interesting; it's about being different. So, venture capitalists is not really about gambling. Interestingly enough, let me provide you with a simple explanation so that everybody can understand. So, John, if you go out and buy a lottery ticket and you win a jackpot, I'll say, John had a lot of luck today. If you go out next week and buy another lottery ticket and you again win a jackpot, I'll say, that's a skill. That's no longer luck. So if you look at smart VCs, then they succeed again and again. It's not 1 out of 20. In fact, smart VCs succeed again and again more than a kind of fair gamble would allow them to. And that is because they follow those principles. So you see, it's not really about gamble. There's a huge difference between gambling and uncertainty. Uncertainty means that even if you're doing everything right, then you still will fail quite a lot. But gambling means that you just will on average fail, and on average, in fact, you're going to lose money. Like if you're going to play lottery every day, you're going to lose money on average, quite a bit of money. Let me give you an example of another principle, John.
Yeah.
That first, that shows that venture capitalists are not gamblers. And second, the principle that I think is really useful for our audience today. The principle that I call in the book, double down or quit. So first of all, let me step back. I already mentioned that startups raise money all the time. In fact, an average unicorn, so a very successful venture capital-backed company, would raise money more than 6 times from venture capitalists. And every single time, venture capitalists need to decide whether to support the startup that they already invested in before, support the startup again. And that is double down. Or do not support, quit. Okay? And so for those of you who play poker, it's actually not dissimilar with how you play poker. You have to decide whether to fold, quit, whether to call, or whether to raise, double down. Okay, whenever new cards are revealed. And what I observed is that smart VCs are particularly careful here. Why? Because in every single investment where we have to decide whether to invest again, we face one of the most challenging issues. Psychologists call it the escalation of commitment. There is a psychological desire to invest again because it is our decision, John. And throwing good money after bad money. Here is a powerful example. Whenever I lead any strategic offsites to executives of large companies, and they're all very smart, very educated people, of course, all very knowledgeable. I play various games with them. I already mentioned the piggy bank. But another game I play is I just ask them to make an investment decision. I show them the numbers, and the investment decision is absolutely horrible. So that in fact, out of 60, 70, 80 people, nobody will make this investment decision. Okay? It's a straightforward no. Then a couple of hours later, I again ask them to make an investment decision. In fact, it is exactly the same investment, exactly the same, with one difference. I start by telling them that 3 years ago, you, on behalf of your company, made an investment and put in 10 million, 50 million, 1 billion, that depends on the size of the company.
Sure.
And 3 years later, that investment did not materialize. So that's what we call sunk cost. And now you have a chance to recoup your investment. And then the decision they have to make, in fact, is exactly the same. So it's the same horrible investment decision that nobody should ever take. Do you know that on average, 60% of executives, John, 60% say yes to this investment decision now? That is called escalation of commitment. It's extremely powerful. And what I observed, and by the way, how I observed, I actually went into hundreds of venture capital firms and studied how they make decisions. What I observed is that smart venture capitalists are like professional poker players. Do you know the difference between amateur poker players and professional poker players? The single biggest difference is that professional poker players fold much more frequently. So that they put the chips on the table and they know that the cards revealed are not very good, they fold. Amateur players think, oh gosh, I already have these chips on the table. The card seems to be not great, but I would like to continue because I can't afford to lose those chips. It's the same with venture capitalists. The difference is that with venture capitalists, they came up with specific methods to do it. And I think we all can learn from those methods. For example, they make decisions in partnerships so that there are a number of partners. And when they make decisions initially to invest in a startup, the partner who is the champion of the deal has a lot of freedom. So very often the partner can make decision on their own. They can just say, oh, I love this startup and I'm going to put $5 million on behalf of the entire venture capital firm. Okay. But if they decide to invest again in the same startup, they will have to go back and ask permission from the entire partnership. And sometimes, quite often in fact, they themselves don't have the right to vote. So that everybody else who did not make the original decision will have to approve. Sometimes, some venture capital firms go even further. They will tell their founders, here's $5 million. We would love to support you in the future. We commit to invest in the future, but only and only if you find another investor as well, who is going to lead the round. Here's an example from real life. I'm sure you've heard about Waymo, self-driving business unit of Google Alphabet. Okay, so here is an interesting fact that on a number of times, Google went out and raised money from external investors to fund Waymo. Why? I mean, Google is awash with money. Google does know what to do with its cash, okay? Why? Well, there are a couple of reasons, but one reason exactly is dealing with this escalation of commitment. Google would like to ensure, Google executives, that they would like to find independent, arm's length investors who will independently look at Waymo, who have never made a decision to invest in Waymo before, and who will value Waymo and will make a decision, therefore, in an unbiased way. And I think that is a great lesson from venture capitalists and from venture-minded organizations for everybody. Be particularly afraid of this escalation of commitment. And by the way, in my experience, owners of businesses very often are particularly subject to it. Why? Because they feel strong psychological attachment to their business. And there's a lot of research showing that the escalation of commitment is a big problem for the owners of small to medium-sized businesses.
Yeah, the good money after bad phenomenon, and it's certainly something I think a lot of our listeners would relate to. This idea of that, continuing to invest in that employee they probably should have let go years ago, or that product line that they love, but the market doesn't seem to have quite the same infatuation with.
And the point, John, is not just to relate to this, but what we do in the book, we identify a lot of what I call specific playbook rules, like behaviors, actions you have to take to make sure that you can solve this escalation of commitment. The point is not to try to avoid the escalation of commitment situation. You cannot. You have to realize this. But the point is to find a solution to this. And this is where I think this venture mindset principles and applications come very useful. Very
in this case, it's to make the decisions with a group or get an external third-party person to validate the decision. In the case of Waymo, another investor, for example. Right. I'm glad you brought up Google, because I wanted to ask you about corporate venture capital. And again, our listeners don't get super wrapped up in all the Silicon Valley ins and outs of Silicon Valley. So a lot of these terms are going to be new to them. How is corporate venture capital different than venture capital and private equity, for that matter? What is corporate venture capital?
Sure. When we say the word venture capital, it actually covers everything. More often people say institutional venture capital or financial venture capital. And that is venture capital where fund managers invest on behalf of their investors, called limited partners. For example, university endowments, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and so on. Corporate venture capital, it's where fund managers or executives invest in startups on behalf of the parent company. So, for example, Google also has, in fact, even 3 corporate venture funds, Capital G, Google Ventures, and Gradient Ventures. And corporate venture capital has become extremely popular and fashionable these days. there's more than 2,000 corporate VCs globally, and my team's been following many of them. In fact, we went in and studied how more than 150 corporate VC arms of large companies, including almost every single one of S&P 500 companies in the US, make decisions designed to compensate their fund managers and their results. There's a big difference between institutional VCs and corporate VCs. And the single biggest difference is that institutional VCs at the end of the day exist for one and one purpose: to make money for themselves and for their investors. Corporate VCs typically have a strategic goal. For example, to help their parent identify threats early on, or to help their parent find startups that can work with their business units and improve their products. So you identify those strategic goals, and very often financial returns matter, but less so, because the amount of total investments made by corporate VCs typically is dwarfed by the total R&D budget or by the annual revenue of the parent company.
It's interesting because for a lot of our listeners who, for those in the technology space may be approached by a corporate VC, there is a downside, right? Because if you take money from Google Ventures as an example, presumably the next round is going to be likely to Google Ventures, or they'll be asked to participate. And you're sharing private information with Google at this point about your company and your plans and your product roadmap. And all of a sudden, that makes it less likely that Microsoft will be interested in acquiring your business because they have seen you sharing all this data with Google Ventures. Have I got that right, or is that am I kind of overstating the concern?
I think there is some concern about that. I'm not really sure it's overstating. I would say it's maybe a little bit exaggerating the problem. First of all, is that many corporate venture funds exist kind of outside their parents. For example, do you know that, Google might not be a good example because Google is in Silicon Valley, but there are many, many corporate VCs in Silicon Valley, and their parents are thousands of miles away. And sometimes, and actually more often these days, there is a Chinese wall between the corporate VC decision-making and the company. But yes, there is some concern, which is if a startup founder, let's say, will take money from a strategic investor, then that strategic investor's direct competitors will not invest or will be unwilling to acquire a company, a startup. Why? It's not just about information sharing. Let's say you have your direct competitor, John, that invested in the company, and you know that that direct competitor has not acquired it. So what you're going to take out, I think, from this is that maybe your competitor knows something that is not publicly available that enables them to make a much better decision. And so you therefore also will not try to acquire the company. So whenever my former students, for example, ask me for advice, there's always trade-offs about whether to take money from strategics. I would say more recently, there are two trends. The first one is investors who are investing on behalf of strategics, which is corporate VCs, have become much more sophisticated. For example, one contractual feature of investments that I always advise founders not to accept from strategic investors is what's called ROFR, R-O-F-R. In fact, I told them, run away from ROFRs. ROFRs is the right of first refusal, which effectively means that if you take money from a strategic investor and the competitor decides to bid, then that strategic will have the right of first refusal at the same price, which effectively makes you much more likely to fail, much less likely to be successful. But more recently, these corporate VCs understand the rules of the game, became more sophisticated. And for example, I observe that they require or they demand less and less ROFRs and other pretty unhelpful contractual terms. There is another important feature, another important trend, John. It's quite recent, is that startups, not only in Silicon Valley but elsewhere, now scale up much faster. And when you scale up much faster, you in fact need that strategic help much quicker. Maybe access to their supply chains, their distribution, their technologies. And as a result of that, I think there are many more early stage startups, even what we call in Series Seed or Series A, which is very, very early stage startups, that in the past would have never taken corporate money. But these days they do. And because that allows them to scale up much, much faster.
Interesting. I'm glad you brought up Ruffer and your cautionary sort of words around that, because I'd love to sort of end our conversation with your advice to founders who are getting term sheets right now from either, growth equity funds at, private equity groups that are looking to invest in growth, or venture capital. And we've heard all the kind of nightmare stories where the VC comes in and makes an investment at a very, very high valuation, and then they're unfortunately, as the market has dropped over the last couple of years, underwater on that investment, and the founders get washed out. I mean, we've heard these stories on this show, and so I think I wanted to sort of get your advice to founders for making sure that they're protected when they go to potentially raise money. What are other than Ruffer, what are the other things to be mindful of?
Yeah. So I spend a lot of time on this with my students. We detail a lot of things in the book as well. One I already mentioned is that whenever you have a term sheet, make sure that you get another term sheet. And therefore you have to be very proactive as the founder or as the executive of the business. Many founders are too reactive, means that they get a term sheet and they start negotiating on the term sheet. The better strategy is to make sure that you have a lot of term sheets, a lot of interest, and then you can negotiate a much better deal. Let me mention something that will be counterintuitive, okay? But that is the whole point about the venture mindset. It's very often counterintuitive. If you would like to sell your business, you really need to have as high valuation as possible. That's the whole point of the piggy bank game. Okay, if I'm selling the piggy, I would like to sell you the piggy at the highest possible value. But if you take an investment from, let's say, growth equity, venture capital firm, you are still in control of your business. You are still a shareholder. And what is really important to understand is that maximizing the valuation at this point is not necessarily the best idea. Because what you're really trying to do is to maximize the future outcome. If you're taking money from the venture capital firm, you typically don't get too much money right away. Your main shareholding is still illiquid, is still in the company. Now, what happens is that if the valuation is too high, then the future could be against you with a much higher probability. If the market goes down, or if you are not as successful as you thought, then the higher the valuation today, the more likely you will experience what we call a down round, which means that the valuation in the future, when you need to raise another round, will be lower than the valuation you achieved or negotiated today. And typically, John, whenever you mentioned earlier, washed out. Now, founders are really washed out when there is a down round, because investors inevitably will get a deal that makes them senior to the founders. So I'm yet to see a growth equity firm that would invest on a terms that will make them junior to founders. So the founders of the businesses typically take an additional risk, a residual risk, as common shareholders. And you would like to avoid a situation of a down round. So just to make it very practical, and I will give you an example of my students. So my students that graduate from Stanford and raise money, and I know they're different from your audience. So they are founders of new startups, okay? But I think the situation here is similar. They go out and raise, and let's say they need to raise $5 million. And the valuation really is about 20, 25 million, okay? And it's called the valuation cap because they're going to raise using convertible notes or safes. But then there's a lot of interest in their startup. And they come back and say, Professor Ilya, I think we should increase this cap to 50 million. And almost every single time I said, don't do it. If you do not want to dilute yourself now, just raise a little bit less. Because once you increase your valuation from 25 to 50, and you are ahead of the market, that really means that when you need to raise money again, you will be compared to all those startups that raised at 50. And it's much more likely that you will not be able to reach the next milestone, because the next milestone, the next criteria, the next threshold is going to be much, much higher. And I observe this too frequently in Silicon Valley and beyond. When initial valuations are too high, everybody is excited for a day because it seems like it's great. We've diluted much less. We still own a majority of the company. And then there is a down round. And when there is a down round, that is the situation where the founders are washed out. In fact, sometimes or quite often, the founders are squeezed out of the company because, in fact, they led to this down round. So let me leave you with this counterintuitive thought. And of course, there is a lot of other stuff that I would recommend. So you either can come to Stanford and take my VC class, or you can get the venture mindset.
Wonderful. And we've got, I've got a whole 2 pages full of notes here, raw for the multiple term sheets. And of course, being careful with avoiding a down round by having a too high evaluation early in your financial cycle. The book is called The Venture Mindset. Ilya, it was a great pleasure. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you, John.